The courtroom on the fourth floor of the Ashford County Family Court building was not a large one. It held maybe 40 people on a busy day, rows of scuffed wooden benches, a water-stained ceiling tile above the jury box that nobody had ever bothered to fix, and a clock on the back wall that ran 4 minutes slow. On an ordinary Tuesday morning, it heard the ordinary business of families falling apart quietly, one signature at a time. This was not an ordinary Tuesday. Judge Daniel Whitmore had sat on that bench for 11 years. He had a reputation among the lawyers who worked this courthouse, a reputation he had built carefully and guarded even more carefully. Even-tempered, exact, unreadable. He did not raise his voice. He did not show his hand. Attorneys joked, not unkindly, that you could read a courtroom by watching every face in it except his. Daniel Whitmore's face gave you nothing. He was 54 years old, silver at the temples, the kind of tall that made his robe hang a little short at the wrists no matter how many times the tailor let it out. He lived alone in a house he had bought after his divorce 9 years earlier. A house with a guest room that had never once had a guest. He ate dinner at his desk more nights than not. His clerk, a sharp young woman named Priya who had worked for him for 3 years, had once asked him, half joking, if he even had a life outside these walls. He had smiled at her, the small closed-mouth smile he used for questions he didn't want to answer, and changed the subject. That morning, the case on his docket was a custody modification hearing. Reyes versus Reyes. He had read the file the night before, the way he read every file the night before, cover to cover, twice. On paper, it was not unusual. A mother, Sarah Reyes, 31 years old, had been raising her son alone for the past 4 years. A father, Marcus Reyes, had recently re-entered the boy's life and was petitioning for shared custody. The mother's attorney was opposing the petition. The maternal grandfather, a man named Walter Higgins, had filed a supporting affidavit calling the father unfit, citing his 4-year absence and, more damningly, a prior felony conviction for embezzlement. It was, on its face, an easy case. Fathers who disappeared for years and came back with a criminal record rarely won these hearings, and Daniel Whitmore had seen enough of them to know the pattern before the first witness was sworn in. What the file did not tell him, what no file could have told him, was that the boy would be the one to speak first. His name was Tommy Reyes. He was 7 years old, small for his age, with a cowlick that refused to lie flat no matter how carefully his mother had combed it that morning, and a collared shirt that was one size too big, the sleeves rolled twice at the cuff. He sat between his mother and her attorney at the petitioner's table, swinging his legs because they didn't reach the floor, and he had said almost nothing since the bailiff called the case. The hearing proceeded the way these hearings usually did. Sarah Reyes testified first, her voice steady but her hands twisting a tissue into a tight rope in her lap. She spoke about the 4 years she had spent working double shifts at a diner off Route 9, about the nights she had come home too exhausted to do anything but heat up soup and help Tommy with his spelling words before bed. She did not speak with bitterness. That, more than anything, was what made her testimony land the way it did. She simply stated facts, the way a person states facts when they have long since stopped expecting sympathy and only want to be believed. Then came Walter Higgins, Sarah's father, a heavy-set man in a gray suit that fit him too well, the kind of suit that told a courtroom he had money and intended for the courtroom to notice. He testified that Marcus Reyes had vanished without explanation 4 years earlier, leaving Sarah alone with a 3-year-old and a stack of unpaid bills. He testified about the embezzlement conviction, reading the case number aloud as though it were scripture. He testified in a tone that was almost gentle, almost reasonable, that a man who had proven himself capable of abandoning his family and stealing from his employer had no business asking a court to hand him access to a little boy who barely remembered his face. Every word of it was true. That was what made it so effective. Marcus Reyes sat at the respondent's table through all of it without moving. He was thin in the way men get thin when they've spent years learning to need less than they used to. His suit, unlike Walter's, did not fit him well. It hung at the shoulders, borrowed or bought secondhand for the occasion. He did not interrupt. He did not shake his head. He kept his eyes on the table in front of him. And twice, Judge Whitmore saw his jaw tighten at something Walter said. And twice, he watched the man make the visible decision to say nothing. When it was his turn to testify, Marcus's attorney, a tired-looking public defender named Ellen Choi, who was clearly carrying twice the caseload she should have been, asked him only a handful of questions, and Marcus answered them in short, careful sentences, like a man walking across ice he didn't trust. "Where were you for the past 4 years, Mr. Reyes?" "I was in prison. 2 years and 8 months of a 4-year sentence at Ashford Correctional. I was released 14 months ago." "And what have you been doing since your release?" "Working. I got a job at a warehouse 2 months after I got out. I've been there since. I got my own apartment 8 months ago. Small place, but it's mine." "Why didn't you contact your son sooner?" Here, for the first time, Marcus hesitated. "Because I didn't think I had the right to. Not yet. I wanted to have something to offer him before I showed up. A steady job. A clean record going forward. Something better than an apology." Ellen Choi asked about the embezzlement charge, and Marcus answered flatly that he had pled guilty on the advice of a public defender he'd met twice before the hearing, that the plea deal offered 2 years less than a trial he could not afford to fight, that he had made a choice between a sentence he could survive and a gamble he could not risk, with a wife and a toddler waiting for him at home. He did not claim innocence outright. He simply said quietly, "I did what I had to do to come home to my family faster. I'm not proud of the choice. I'd make it again." It was not a defense that moved the courtroom. Judge Whitmore watched Walter Higgins's mouth curl very slightly at the corner, the expression of a man who believes he has already won. And then Ellen Choi did something unusual. She turned to the judge and asked permission for the child to make a brief statement off the record of formal testimony, simply so the court could hear, in the boy's own words, how he felt about his father's return. It was an unusual request. Judges rarely allowed young children to speak directly in contested hearings. The risk of coaching, of trauma, of putting a 7-year-old in the position of choosing between his parents in open court, was exactly the kind of risk family court existed to avoid. Judge Whitmore should have said no. Every instinct built over 11 years told him to say no, to rely on the court-appointed guardian ad litem's written report instead, the way the process was designed to work. He looked at the boy. Tommy Reyes was looking back at him, not at his mother, not at his father, not at his grandfather, at him. And there was something in the boy's face, some quiet, exhausted patience, that made Daniel Whitmore's chest tighten in a way he did not have a name for yet. "Briefly," he said, "and only if he wants to." Tommy stood up. He was so small that even standing, his eyes were barely above the edge of the table. Ellen Choi crouched beside him for a moment, murmuring something too low for the room to hear, and then stepped back. The boy looked at his father first, for a long moment. Marcus Reyes looked back at him with an expression that Daniel Whitmore, even from the bench, could only describe as a man watching something he was terrified of losing before he'd even finished getting it back. Then Tommy turned and looked up at the judge and asked the question that would end the version of Daniel Whitmore's life that had existed before that morning. "Why didn't my dad ever come home?" He did not ask it angrily. He did not ask it the way a lawyer might have coached a child to ask it, for effect, for sympathy. He asked it the way a 7-year-old asks a question he has genuinely never understood, the way a child asks why the sky is blue, or why his friend's parents got divorced. Plain, unshielded, waiting for an actual answer, because in his experience so far, adults had always had an answer for everything except this. The courtroom went silent. Not the practiced, procedural silence of a hearing between witnesses, but a real silence, the kind that has weight, that presses down on a room and makes people afraid to breathe too loudly. Sarah Reyes pressed the tissue to her mouth. Marcus Reyes's shoulders began, almost imperceptibly, to shake. Even Walter Higgins, for the first time all morning, looked away. And Judge Daniel Whitmore, who had not raised his voice or lost his composure on that bench in 11 years, who was famous in that courthouse for a face that gave nothing away, felt his throat close and his eyes sting. And for 3 long seconds, he could not speak at all. Because he had asked that exact question once, word for word, 39 years earlier, to a man who never got the chance to answer it. Daniel Whitmore had grown up in a small house on the edge of a mill town in Ohio, the kind of town that had 1 good decade left in it when he was born, and spent all of it slowly running out. His father, Robert Whitmore, worked the floor at the textile mill, and when the mill started cutting shifts in the recession years, he took a second job doing overnight stocking at a grocery warehouse to make up the difference. Then a third, weekend landscaping work for a company 2 towns over, because even 2 jobs weren't quite enough once Daniel's little sister needed braces and the roof needed patching before winter. Daniel did not understand any of this at 7 years old. What he understood was that his father was gone before he woke up and home after he was asleep, sometimes for entire weeks at a stretch. What he understood was birthday parties his father missed, a Little League season his father saw exactly 1 game of, a school play where Daniel had looked out at the audience during his one line and found his mother's face and an empty seat beside her. He remembered, with a clarity that 40 years had not dulled at all, the night he finally asked. He had been sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, and his father had come in past 9, smelling of cut grass and machine grease at once. And Daniel had looked up and asked in the flat, wounded voice of a child who has decided he is owed an explanation. "Why do you never come home?" His father had stopped in the doorway. He remembered that his father's face had done something complicated, something Daniel was too young to read at the time and had spent decades since trying to translate. Robert Whitmore had not answered with words. He had crossed the kitchen and knelt down so he was eye level with his son and said only, "I'm trying to, Danny. I'm trying to come home for good. Just give me a little more time." And then he had gone to bed, because he had 4 hours before the overnight shift started again. 6 weeks later, Robert Whitmore collapsed on the warehouse floor at 2 in the morning. A heart attack, the doctors said afterward, brought on by exhaustion the way a dam gives way, not from one flood, but from years of small cracks nobody patched. He was 41 years old. He never came home again, not for good, not for a single more ordinary Tuesday. And the last real question his son had ever asked him was the one that, in the private mythology of a grieving 9-year-old boy, Daniel had quietly, irrationally, unforgivably blamed himself for. As though the question itself had been a weight that broke something already too strained to bear it. He had never told anyone that. Not his ex-wife, in 11 years of marriage. Not Priya, in 3 years of watching him eat dinner alone at his desk. He had built an entire adult life, a whole self, around the practice of not needing anyone to come home to him, because some unexamined part of him had decided, at 9 years old, that wanting it too openly was what killed people. And now a 7-year-old boy in oversized sleeves was standing in his courtroom asking the exact question, in the exact words. And Daniel Whitmore understood, with a clarity that arrived like a physical blow, that he had spent 39 years sitting in judgment of absent fathers from the safety of a bench, and had never once let himself ask what it had cost his own father to be one, or what it had cost the boy he used to be to ask. He asked for a 10-minute recess. It was, Priya told him later, the first time in 3 years she had ever seen him ask for one mid-hearing. He went into his chambers, closed the door, and sat with his hands flat on the desk until they stopped shaking. When he came back, he did something he had never done in 11 years on that bench. He asked the guardian ad litem, a calm, thorough woman named Ruth Okafor, who had been appointed to represent Tommy's interests independent of either parent, to step forward and speak fully. And he asked her not to summarize, but to read her full investigative report into the record, all of it. Because he had a feeling, sitting there, that the story the courtroom had been told so far was not the whole story, and he was no longer willing to rule on half of one. Ruth Okafor's report took 40 minutes to read. It changed the entire shape of the case. She had done what neither attorney's limited resources had allowed them to do. She had pulled the full record of Marcus Reyes's embezzlement case, not just the conviction, but the underlying company audit. Marcus had worked, at the time, as an assistant bookkeeper at a mid-sized construction supply company. Walter Higgins had, at that time, sat on the company's board of directors, a fact that had not come up once in his testimony that morning. The audit that led to Marcus's arrest had been conducted internally, not by an outside firm, and the discrepancies attributed to Marcus's accounts bore a pattern, Ruth Okafor noted carefully, that matched a much larger set of discrepancies in accounts controlled by a senior executive who had left the company abruptly 6 months after Marcus's arrest and had never been investigated at all. Ruth Okafor was careful, professionally careful, not to accuse anyone of anything the record did not support. But she laid out, in her flat, methodical voice, the timeline. Marcus Reyes had been 3 months from being promoted to a position that would have given him access to the same accounts the senior executive had been quietly draining for 2 years. Marcus had begun asking questions about irregularities he'd noticed. 6 weeks after he raised those questions with his supervisor, he was the one being audited. Walter Higgins, sitting on the board, had personally recommended the public defender's office handle the plea negotiation rather than allow the case to go to trial, citing cost concerns to the company. And there was one more detail, the detail that made the room go still for the second time that morning. In the 8 months since Marcus's release, he had written to Sarah 4 times asking to see Tommy, and Sarah had never received the letters. They had been sent, per postal tracking Ruth Okafor had subpoenaed, to Sarah's address, and signed for, each time, by Walter Higgins, who had been staying with his daughter and grandson during a period when Sarah's apartment building had a broken buzzer, and mail was collected downstairs by whoever got to it first. Walter Higgins, seated in the gallery, went very pale. Judge Whitmore did not raise his voice when he addressed him. He did not need to. "Mr. Higgins," he said, "you sat on the board of the company that accused Mr. Reyes of the exact financial misconduct that, per this audit, appears far more consistent with a different executive's activity. You then intercepted 4 letters from a father attempting, in good faith, to re-establish contact with his son, and you presented this court, this morning, with a narrative of abandonment that you personally had a significant hand in constructing. I want to be very precise, because I intend for this to be part of the record. I am not making a finding of criminal conduct here today. That is not what this hearing is for. but I am making a finding that your testimony this morning was not merely incomplete. It was, at minimum, profoundly misleading, offered by a man with an obvious personal stake in this family's custody arrangement, and I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for further review, both as to the original embezzlement case and as to the interception of mail addressed to your daughter. Walter Higgins said nothing. There was, for once, nothing left for him to say. The recess that followed was longer this time, and when the hearing resumed, the tenor of the room had shifted entirely. Sarah Reyes, given a moment alone with Ruth Okafor's findings, had wept. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to relief. The specific, exhausted relief of a person discovering that the years of resentment they had quietly nursed toward an absent man had been, at least in significant part, misdirected. She did not withdraw her objection to the custody petition outright. She was, Judge Whitmore noted with something like respect, too careful a mother for that. But when Ellen Choi asked her gently, on the stand for a final time, what she wanted, she said, "I want Tommy to have his father. A real chance at it. Slowly, if that's what's careful. But a real one." It was nearly 1 in the afternoon by the time Judge Whitmore prepared to issue his ruling, and the courtroom, which had been half empty at 9 that morning, had filled with a handful of court staff and a reporter from the local paper who had wandered in for an unrelated case and stayed once word of what was unfolding spread down the hallway. He did not read from a prepared script. He rarely did, but today especially, he set his notes aside. "In 11 years on this bench," he said, "I have handled several hundred custody matters, and I have developed, I think, a reasonably reliable instinct for when a parent's absence reflects an absence of love, and when it reflects a man doing the wrong things for reasons he believed, however imperfectly, were the right ones. I want to be careful here, because a guilty plea to a felony is a serious matter regardless of the circumstances that produced it. And Mr. Reyes bears responsibility for the choice he made, even a choice made under pressure I now believe was engineered against him. This court does not exist to relitigate a criminal case that has already been resolved. But this court does exist to determine what is in the best interest of a 7-year-old boy. And I have rarely seen a father work harder, with less recognition and less support, to earn back a place in his son's life than Mr. Reyes has in the 14 months since his release. A steady job, a stable home, 4 letters written and sent in good faith to a son he was told, apparently by design, had no interest in hearing from him. I am granting the petition for shared custody on a graduated schedule recommended by the guardian ad litem, beginning with supervised weekend visits and expanding, contingent on continued stability over the coming year. He paused. And then, because the morning had cracked something open in him that 11 years of careful composure had kept sealed, he found himself saying something that was not, strictly, part of any ruling. "I want to say one more thing, and I want to say it directly to Tommy, if that's all right." Ellen Choi, surprised, glanced at Sarah, who nodded and gently nudged her son forward. Judge Whitmore looked down at the small boy standing again at the edge of the table, sleeves rolled twice at the cuff, and for a moment the 11 years of robe and bench and careful distance fell away, and he was, in some private corner of himself, 9 years old again, sitting at a kitchen table asking a question a man never got the chance to answer. "You asked a question this morning that most people spend their whole lives too afraid to ask out loud," he said. "Why didn't your dad come home?" It's a fair question. It might be the fairest question there is. And I want you to know that sometimes the answer isn't that a person didn't want to. Sometimes the answer is complicated and unfair, and it takes people like Ms. Okafor a lot of work to find the truth of it. "Your father didn't stop trying to come home, Tommy. He was kept from you by people who should have helped him instead. That's not the same thing as not wanting to be there. I hope you'll remember that difference because it's one I didn't understand myself until I was a lot older than you, and it cost me something I never got back. Don't let it cost you. His voice, by the end of it, was not entirely steady, and later, in his chambers, alone, Daniel Whitmore would sit for a long while with his hands flat on the desk again, thinking not of the ruling, which had been correct, but of a kitchen in Ohio 39 years gone, and a man kneeling down to look his son in the eye with 4 hours left before a shift that would kill him, saying, "I'm trying, Danny. Just give me a little more time." He had never had the chance to give his father that time, but he had, today, without entirely planning to, given a stranger's son the chance his own father never got. That evening, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, Judge Daniel Whitmore did not eat dinner at his desk. He drove instead 40 minutes out of his way to the small cemetery where his parents were buried, a place he visited twice a year out of duty and had not visited out of anything else in a very long time. He stood at his father's headstone in the fading light with his hands in his coat pockets, and he said, out loud, to a man who had been dead for 39 years, the words he had never gotten to say. "I understand now," he said. "You were trying. I know that now. I'm sorry it took me this long to believe it." 3 months later, Ruth Okafor's follow-up report noted that the graduated custody schedule was proceeding well. Tommy had begun spending alternating weekends with his father, and Sarah, in her own updated statement to the court, described watching her son run across a parking lot into his father's arms with an ease that told her, more than any legal document could, that the arrangement was working. The district attorney's office confirmed it had opened a formal review into the original embezzlement case, based on the audit discrepancies Ruth Okafor had flagged, and into 2 counts of mail interception against Walter Higgins, who resigned quietly from the company board before the review concluded. And on the second Saturday of that following spring, when Judge Whitmore happened to be walking through the small public park 2 blocks from the courthouse during his lunch hour, he saw them without meaning to. A thin man in a warehouse uniform, pushing a boy on a swing set, laughing at something the boy had said, the boy's cowlick still refusing to lie flat, his sleeves this time rolled up because they finally fit. Marcus Reyes looked up and recognized him, and for a moment neither man knew quite what to do with that. Then Marcus simply nodded, a small, grateful nod, the kind exchanged between 2 people who both understand something the rest of the park does not. And Daniel Whitmore nodded back, and kept walking, and did not try to explain to himself why his eyes were wet again, because for the first time in 39 years, he thought he finally understood the answer to a question a boy had once asked a man who never got the chance to answer it. The dad came home. It just took the both of them a little longer than either one had ever wanted it to.